أود تنويه قبل البدء بأن المحاضرة سوف تكون باللغة الإنجليزية. توجد أجهزة ترجمة متوفرة عند المدخل لمن يحتاجها. Dear esteemed guests, it's a pleasure to have you here today in Cave Chris Public Lecture. Today's topic circulates around an era within the history of the Arabian Peninsula. The significance of today's lecture is that it discusses very important yet understudied French Orientalist pieces of work on the history of Hijaz. And thankfully, we have our colleague here, Dr. Louis Plan, who very kindly took the effort to document the work mentioned. Dr. Louis is a Senior Associate Fellow at Cave Chris and the Director of the Middle East Directions Program at the European University in Florence. He previously served the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs as an Arabist diploma in various Arabic countries, including Saudi Arabia. Dr. Plan, we are all eager to hear the story of your book on Alexander Dumas, and the floor is yours.
So I will begin with the conference of about Alexandre Dumas, who's one of the main French novelists and authors, and of the Alexandre Dumas stories. You probably have heard about the Three Musketeers, but there are so many other stories which attracted the whole people in the 19th century up to now. And he is considered as one of our more prominent writers. He's buried in the Panthéon, which is the Qabr al-Uzama in Paris. So his attraction to Arabia is hardly known, although he devoted 4 writings on it. He had his eyes and imagination turned towards the Red Sea as a precursor to a long series of French authors fascinated by this very region. Conversely, he would not have published writings on Arabia if he had not known that he would thereby satisfy the public's tastes for mystery and adventure. The biographers of Dumas have, however, neglected this side of his work. Alexandre Dumas presented in 1834 the plans for a series of 4 to 6 volumes that he intended to write at the end of a trip to the East, planned from Italy to the Middle East via Syria and Egypt. But he failed to satisfy his aspirations for the splendid East and not the misty West, as he wrote. We can therefore understand the attention he paid to this region ranged from 1849 to 1866, a period during which Europeans were discovering it. Dumas lent his pen to the writing and publication of the stories of 4 travelers fallen into oblivion: Thomas-Joseph Arnaud, Alexandre Vessières, Louis Ducouré, and Élise Éveillard. The 3 men were his own friends, and the last one, a woman, was a friend of his daughter. He put his notoriety at their service. They speak through the voice of Dumas in his writings, who conversely uses his power as a storyteller to slip in his ideas in the narration. Dumas' first writing is entitled The Jeddah Massacre, which is known here as Fitna Jeddah. It took place in 1858 in Jeddah, a city then Ottoman, reported by its French heroine, Élise Éveillard, and Dumas published it in a paper called Le Nouvel Illustré, a daily he launched in 1866, and it disappeared a year later. That's why he never published it in a book. And It is therefore completely unknown to the public and does not appear in the bibliography of his works. And by chance, I found it on eBay. You probably know eBay. Because I have published 2 books on Jeddah, and I was on eBay searching for photos. I have published a book on the old French photographs of Jeddah, and I discovered this writing, which was not published. It was only some sheets of paper. That's how it went. So what is it about? The incident which lit the population of Jeddah at the time broke out over the application of British consular jurisdiction to a merchant ship owned by an Indian who was an Ottoman subject. It illustrates the interference and the growing role played by the consuls in Jeddah at the time due to the importance of European trade with India, Jeddah, of course, being in the middle. The British consul was a trader, which made him a competitor of the city's merchants. And you surely know that Jeddah was a city of merchants. There is nothing else than trade in Jeddah at all. So the local court had pronounced the passage of a ship from the British jurisdiction to that of the Ottomans. The anger of the local merchants erupted when the consul, the British consul, refusing these conclusions, boarded the ship to bring the Ottoman flag, trampled it underfoot, and seized the ship. The French consul, a newcomer to Jeddah, tried to mediate without success, and it took him very badly, because the revolt led to the massacre of 23 Europeans, including the 2 consuls. The UK resorted to gunboat diplomacy, bombarding Jeddah to force its rulers to punish those responsible for the massacre. The British Foreign Secretary warned the Ottomans that, I quote, Jeddah would be occupied if justice was not done soon. European armies then stepped onto the soil of the Hijaz for the first time in history to witness their execution. And you can see it now on the slide. This massacre ultimately marks a popular revolt against European greed aimed at preserving the interest of a city devoid of any resource other than trade. However, the French and the British then made out of it a Muslim conspiracy aimed at driving the Christians out of the Hijaz. The vast majority of French writings on the Jeddah massacre reduce the matter to a religious question and stigmatize Muslim fanaticism. However, no French author had ever mentioned any religious problem in Jeddah before 1858, which clearly shows how much the commentators were ignorant of the realities. Here are the photos of the consul of France and his wife, both victims of the massacre, and of the 2 survivors, their daughter Élise, and the consul's deputy, Louis Emera, whom she will marry after the tragedy. Both bravely fought the rioters. The story of the heroine of the massacre, reported by Alexandre Dumas, throws an original light compared to its relationship in the press of the time. And this matters because one could hardly find a better source than Élise Eveillard, the daughter of the consul, who reports the drama with a precious insight, and she evacuates any religious dimension. On the contrary, recounting with simplicity her rescue and that of her future husband by Muslims. This massacre has marked memories in France and the UK until the end of the century, in a context of stigmatization of Arabs and Islam. Jeddah therefore burst into the French public in the worst ways, with unexpected consequences. The Bouquet, which is a company, the Bouquet workshop in Rouen city, close to Paris, produced the illustrated handkerchief, which is screened now, entitled The Massacre of Jeddah, which immortalized the assassination of the French consul on an accessory used daily at that time. You know, at that time people didn't wear a tie with, like me. They used to wear this kind of handkerchief. So you see here on the handkerchief, from right to left, Louis Emera. This is Louis Emera. Élise Veillard, the daughter of the consul. Here the consul who is slaughtered, and his wife already dead. So we find in this short story by Alexandre Dumas his gift for dramatic staging, which gives the story a literary dimension. Dumas swells the ranks of humanist authors, rejecting the thesis of the anti-Christian atavism of Muslims. The other one who wrote a piece on the Jeddah massacre being Victor Hugo. We come now to the second work. In 1850, Alexandre Dumas wrote an introduction to the stories of two travelers, Arnaud and Vessières, who had asked him to publish their travelogue. Arnaud and Vessières' journey resulted from the Egyptian expansion in the Hijaz, to which they had contributed by serving in the army of the Viceroy of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who opened the doors, of course, of Arabia to France by enlisting a number of French officers, so much that Arnaud himself writes that at that time the French were reigning in Cairo. Arnaud left for Yemen in 1843 and became the first ever European to enter the city of Ma'rib, where his archaeological findings confirmed the existence of the kingdom of Sheba, Mamlakat Saba. Dumas wrote an introduction to Arnaud's travelogue. The traveler's declining health forced him to put an end to his journeys when he was under 40. Forgotten despite his achievements, he retired to his brother's home in Algeria, where he died anonymously. In his introduction, Dumas encouraged the French to respond to the British establishment in the region, which began in 1836, by trying to counter the British-Ottoman alliance. He advocates a Franco-Arab alliance in the Red Sea aimed at undermining the British presence in India. Dumas dreamed of including in this alliance Ethiopia. His reasoning was based on the request for an alliance with France expressed by the sovereign of Tigray, which is the northern part of today's Ethiopia, sent to the King Louis Philippe in 1845. Dumas regrets that this king declined the proposal. His writing clearly reflects the French enthusiasm for the region, which resulted in the opening of French consular agencies in Jeddah in 1839 and then in Massawa on the western coast of the Red Sea. We also find in Dumas' writings an amazing panegyric of Wahhabism, which the Ottomans had managed to contain the expansion of at that time. Like other European liberals marked by the Greek War of Independence against the Ottomans, Dumas denounces their despotism, and he calls on the French leaders to ally themselves with their opponents in Arabia, namely the Wahhabis, and proposed to associate to this alliance Al-Amir Abd al-Qadir al-Jazairi, who was the main opponent of the French colonization of Algeria, and Ethiopia, of course, as I mentioned. So he had a plan for a Franco-Ethiopian-Algerian-Saudi coalition against Britain and the Ottoman. But it remained, of course, it fizzled out. And it remains, nevertheless, a testimony of the pro-Arab feelings of the most prominent French writers at that time, not only Alexandre Dumas, but also Alphonse de Lamartine and Victor Hugo. Now, the third work of Dumas I presented in my book is Alexandre Vessières. It's a foreword to his travelogue. He was an officer in the army of Ibrahim Pasha, the son of Muhammad Ali Pasha, and he served in it before joining Arnaud, which we had just seen and counted, in Alexandria. They both made 2 trips to the Hijaz, Yemen, and Ethiopia. After returning to France in 1856, Vessières published this travelogue introduced by Dumas, and he set out again soon to hunt elephants in the Wadi Nile, and he died at 44, probably murdered, at the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, that's to say in Al-Khartoum. We come now to the main work. Alexandre Dumas published with Louis Ducouré, we can see on the slide, who's 100% French, by the way, so like me. So now Louis Ducouré is hardly known nowadays, be it here in Saudi or in France and anywhere else. He nevertheless wrote 2 big books with Alexandre Dumas. Only the first of these 2 appears in the dictionary of the works of Dumas. The other has been forgotten. The publisher ranks them in the complete works of Dumas. And these travelogues bring together the account of the travel made to the Hijaz and Yemen from 1842 to 1844 by Louis Ducouré, written by Alexandre Dumas from his travel notes and their cantor when he was back in France. They stayed together, and Dumas described his work as follows in his foreword: "While he speaks, I write." Dumas embellishes with his talent as a storyteller and sometimes with his imagination the extraordinary but real adventures of Louis Ducouré. He seizes the facts he reports to make an odyssey out of it in the great romantic tradition. The whole forms an amazing relation of adventures in the East, fascinating and yet forgotten. Louis Ducouré is so unloved by his biographers that it's difficult to recount his career. He signed his travelogues with the name adopted after he converted to Islam, Abd al-Hamid, which he would preface with Hajji, after having made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he would add the title of Bey, once awarded by the Ottoman governor of Mecca, whom he served in the holy city, hence his author name of Hajji Abdel Hamid Bey. He left France at the age of 24 for Egypt when Muhammad Ali Pasha enlisted him in his army. He was charged in 1840 with a mission to explore the Upper Nile Valley. He pushed as far as present-day South Sudan. Back in Cairo, he set out again for a trip with Baghdad as its objective, which lasted from 1842 to 1847. He converted to Islam in Jeddah, from where he went to Mecca, where he settled for more than a year as a personal advisor to the Grand Sharif, Muhammad ibn Aoun. There, he met an emissary of Sharif Hussein, Amir of Abu Arish, a town close to Jizan, which became now a secondary one. At the time, it was a big one, who called him to his side to reorganize his army. His emirate at the time included all the region from Asir to Madiq Bab al-Mandab. Ducouré encouraged Hussein to resist the United Kingdom, which has had its sites and its possessions from Aden, where they were settled, the Brits, and its Ottoman ally, whose relations with its turbulent vassal were difficult. Ducouré actually aspired to raise the Arabs against the Ottomans as a precursor to Lawrence of Arabia. Ducouré stayed a little over a year in the town of Abu Arish, which he left for Mocha, Sana'a, the Hadramaut, and Masqat. His travelogue stops at this city, but his wanderings did continue in Najd, where he went into jail after suffering shipwreck. He then traveled to Iraq, Persia, where he spent 3 months in prison before escaping, Afghanistan, and the African coast of the Indian Ocean. Hopefully one day somebody will find the notes he recorded throughout all these travels, and he returned to France at the end of this trip in 1847. He set out again in 1850 to undertake a journey throughout the African continent. He has planned to cross the continent from Tunis to the Cape of Good Hope by land. It was planned for 5 years, but it didn't last more than 6 months because after having remarried with a Tunisian Muslim woman, he got caught in the revolt of Sharif Mohammed bin Abdullah in the Algerian desert, and he was compelled to go back to France. And he compelled to Napoleon III. After that, you can see his memoir he sent to Napoleon III, who was the emperor, the second emperor of France at that time after Napoleon I. Ducouré had met Dumas in 1838 in Italy. Once back from his Middle Eastern travels, he asked him to publish jointly a travelogue and gave him all his travel notes. The trauma of the premature death of their two fathers, who jointly combated in the army of Napoleon, welded the friendship between the two. And Freemasonry represented the other unacknowledged factor of rapprochement between the two men. Why do I quote this? Because first, Alexandre Dumas and Louis Ducouré were both Freemasons, but nobody has ever wrote about it. And what led Louis Ducouré to work for more than 1 year as a military advisor to the Sharif Hussein of Abu Arish was something very peculiar, which I believe nobody has ever discovered, is that this emir was a Freemason as well. And then he went to Yemen and he met Emir Hussein, who was a Sunni, close to the Wahhabis, by the way. Then he went to Yemen and he met with a Shia, let's say, leader who was trying to convince the Yemenis that he was the Mahdi. And it went him badly because he was murdered by the Imam of Sana'a. But he nevertheless had a very big success in the region close to Tariz, from Tariz to Damar. And he was a Freemason as well. And then why did he go to Muscat, as I just told you? Because it was not the Emir. In Muscat, he was a Sultan, of course. And the Sultan happened to be a Freemason as well. It's Freemasonry in Arabia. I don't know if you folks have something, some malaria about it. It will be fun to discover it because it's something scarcely known. So I come back to my things. So Ducouré recounts the end of his travel to Yemen, followed by Hadramaut and Oman, in his last work published in 1859, The Mysteries of the Desert. He writes in his foreword that he has 6 other works in preparation, which corresponds to the 8 collections of travel notes entrusted to Dumas. Only 3 of them have been published, and in my book you will find 2 of them. A financial dispute had arisen between Dumas and Ducouré, and this was the end of this prominent traveler, because he went completely forgotten and he died in poverty and anonymity in Paris in 1867. Louis Ducouré is the first French convert to Islam to have published the account of his experience in Mecca. The other Europeans who brought back accounts of their trip to Mecca in the 19th century on their return denied the suspicions of apostasy of their compatriots, asserting that their conversion and their alleged Muslim identity were purely utilitarian. Such was not the choice of Louis Ducouré, which undoubtedly earned him suspicion and oblivion. None of the many compilations on European travelers in Arabia mention his name, despite the quality and originality of his travelogue. During his trip, Ducouré said he was a Turk from Mecca, then under Ottoman rule. When a Yemeni asks him about his place of birth, he answers Mecca, adding that although born in France, it was in the Holy City that he was reborn by embracing Islam. He became a special advisor to the Grand Sharif, the only Frenchman in history to have held an eminent position in Mecca. We see on the slide here Ibn Aoun at this, it's an English drawing, and his son Abdullah. Abdullah ibn Aoun is the first ever this photo is the first ever photo of any national of the Arabian Peninsula ever taken. It dates back to 1842, 2 or 3 years after the invention of photography. It has been taken by a French photographer in Cairo, where he was for a trip. The original is in the Qatar Museum. The description of Mecca delivered by Dumas and Ducouré is peculiar and provides the French-speaking reader with many previously unpublished details about the city and its religious functions, which retain great historical interest today. Dumas put his notoriety at the service of Ducouré, out of friendship, no doubt, but also for educational purposes. Exposing Muslim traditions and rites and describing holy places took an innovative character in a French context, denigrating Islam at the time. The story of Louis Ducouré, his stay in Mecca, provides a wealth of information on its daily life in the middle of the 19th century. It has an exceptional significance as the holy city then belonged to the domain of myth. Among Europeans, as you see on the slide, it's illustrated by their belief in the levitation of the tomb of the Prophet, which they commonly located in Mecca. The story smashes this legend and, in general, demystifies Islam by trivializing its cradle. The pilgrimage, the conversion, and then the fidelity to Islam of Louis Ducouré is the main reason, in my views, for the halo of suspicion that surrounded him and for his reputation as an impostor. In France, then considering this religion as exotic and its converts as renegades. Haji Abdelhamid Bey transgressed the norm. Dumas inserts in the book a history of Islam, the exposition of its rites, and a biography of the Prophet, which he concludes as follows, I quote, "To merge all these beliefs into one, to unite all the Arabs under a common law, and to give these people a new impetus, such was the immense task which the genius of Muhammad undertook. How then can a tribute of praise be refused to the creator of all that Muslim history offers, that is great, noble, glorious?" As for the reporter of the first story presented by Louis Ducouré before the Oriental Society in Paris, he indicates that, I quote, "without abdicating his nationality, Mr. Ducouré had taken the customs, the costume, the very religion of the Arabs. He therefore assimilates Islam and Arabity and implies their incompatibility with French nationality. Ducouré has tried all along his life to prove the contrary without success. The rejection he suffered stems from the acceptance of the concept of Islam in his time, which de facto excluded a French convert to Islam from the national community. The goal of Louis Ducouré in his writings was, I quote, "to make clear the prodigious political and humanitarian results that the future holds for the East by the probable reconstitution of the powerful Arab nationality." Behind the adventurer, therefore, looms the advocate of a cause, that of the Arabs and Islam, of which he was convinced that France was the best herald at a crucial period in the rise of European imperialism. His stay of more than a year in the service of Sharif Hussein at Abu Arish was aimed at supporting a fierce enemy of British imperialism into Arabia, of which it went without saying in his eyes that France was the ally. His sympathy for the Arabs does not prevent him from being insightful about their weaknesses, which makes the book startlingly topical when it reports the remarks made in 1844 by the Imam of Sana'a a few weeks before he was assassinated. I quote, "Were the Arabs not divided, what power would they not have? And what strength would they not find in their unity? 1844. Historians have so far paid little attention to the history of the Emirate of Abu Arish. Today, a simple town in southern Saudi Arabia, this city indirectly owed its ephemeral glory to a major political development that underlies our traveler's story, the development of Franco-British rivalry in the Red Sea, an indirect effect of the competition for control of the route to India. In Mecca, as in Abu Arish or Sana'a, we see through Dumas writings how the locals try to oppose the external powers, the Ottoman Empire and the UK, while seeking to ally themselves with them in the incessant fratricidal quarrels stemming from their hegemonic ambitions. To this end, the external powers exploit tribal affiliations, the basis of the anthropology of Arabia at that time, and sometimes religion. Ducouré recounts his amazing meeting with the Zaydi Mahdi Hassan. I just talked about him 2 minutes ago, who set Yemen ablaze at that time from the depth of a lost cave near the town of Damar, and he discovers his from Freemasonry. Freemasonry was both shared by Sunnis and Shias at that time, and there were both these people who were interested by Freemasonry were, in my views, influenced by the Egyptians, because Ibrahim Pasha, Ibn Muhammad Ali Pasha, was a Freemason as well. And Freemasonry at that time was quite popular in Istanbul. And most of these leaders had traveled to Istanbul because they were, of course, Ottoman subjects. Dumas and Louis Ducouré, on the contrary, tried to promote an Arab kingdom based in Mecca as a capital. This travelogue represents for the historian an incomparable source of data, covering the most diverse fields of knowledge: cartography, botany, zoology, medicine, ethnology, navigation, international trade, religion, social sciences, international relations, literary history, of course. It has, although, nothing to do with this dissertation. You never get bored with the adventures of all kinds experienced by the hero: navigation disturbed by the storm, fishing for sharks or giant squid, huntings for panthers or hyenas, discovery of horrible snakes and scorpions, tribal or international conflicts, fevers and diseases, love stories, conversion to Islam, and painful circumcision. All the facets of an Arabian full of humanity and wildlife appear in a narration that fascinates the reader while instructing him on a region hardly known in Europe at that time. Ducouré is not a learned Orientalist, but he knows enough Arabic and Turkish to evolve in the Orient like a fish in water. His linguistic abilities allow him to understand the lingua franca. It was the language of communication of the region. It completely disappeared. It was a mixture of Italian, French, and Arabic. It was spoken all over the Mediterranean. He's not an etymologist either, but he quotes surahs from the Quran wisely. His account of palace intrigues and tribal conflicts draws the anthropological determinants of Arabia better than a treatise. His assessment of the relationship between the British in Aden and their Yemeni environment is of a remarkable sociological and political accuracy. The prose of Dumas and Ducouré embellishes reality to seduce the reader and combines the pleasures of literature with the history of science, including humanities. Among the many passages illustrating this eclecticism, we may choose the gaze cast on the jumble of the Emir of Abu Arish, a literary feat summarizing better than many scholarly studies the cultural and political shock caused by the intrusion of European modernity in a remote Arabian town in the middle of the 19th century. None of the numerous works devoted to European travelers in Arabia, however, mentions Ducouré. Forgetting a travelogue so innovative is surprising in the midst of the scarcity of European historiography of Mecca. A true explorer, Ducouré is also the first European to have recounted his crossing of the interior of Yemen from Mocha on the Red Sea to Sana'a and Mukalla, the port of Hadramaut. He is therefore the European discoverer of Hadramaut. Dumas summarizes his friend's passion for the region by quoting in his foreword a proverb of which I believe he's the author. I quote, "As soon as a foreigner touches the land of the Orient, it sprouts roots at his feet." Louis Ducouré displayed his non-conformity in Paris to the point that his supporters struggled to plead his cause, convinced that his Islam was pure simulation. I quote, "All of Paris must know him today. The strangeness of his costume is due to him attempting and carrying out the pilgrimage to Mecca. The fugitive from the home carried the name of France far and wide. He opened new paths for missionaries of the Christian religion." This vision, a crazy one, tries to rehabilitate the lost Frenchman, since converted to Islam, by presenting him as a missionary of France. Hajji Abdelhamid Bey will keep his appearance until the end. As his obituary note indicates, you can imagine Hajji Louis Ducouré walking in the street of Paris at the midst of the 19th century in that with this clothing. So I quote the obituary of which appeared in the press, just 3 lines. "He has just died in Paris, perhaps the last of the originals of the street, Colonel Ducouré, whom we met every day going about his little business in a somewhat faded Oriental costume, it must be admitted." In his writing, Dumas does not put the Orient at the service of a literary ambition. He does not seek himself in Arabia, unlike other more narcissistic Orientalist writers. The Orient attracts him as an object of intellectual and human curiosity, but also on a material basis, because he was very fond of hunting, and he described hunting scenes at that time in the mountain of Asir and Yemen, which are really marvelous. The Orientals encountered in his writing are full of humanity. He doesn't spare them the features of his caustic humor and reserves the same treatment for them as for his European characters. He respects them as a humanist without borders, at a time when many Europeans used to demonize them, or on the contrary, to make them characters from the 1001 Nights. Alexandre Dumas, Arabia's, has nothing mythical. The adventures of his heroes reflect the reality of a land where the Bedouins used to plunder travelers at any time, and of a Red Sea that used to toss the ships according to a capricious wind regime. Even rooted in the century, Dumas' prose on Arabia is devoid of culturalism. His stories do justice to the authors as well as to their native actors, from the emirs to the people of little means. One would search in vain from some disparaging accent towards them when he declares, for instance, that, I quote, the Arab is the philosopher, the wise man of the civilized world. He even goes against the colonial racism of his times. This travelogue is the first major French ethnographic document on Arabia. Dumas shows an ethnological interest in this region and in its religion and followers. He is not attracted by spirituality, but by people and action. This is of fundamental importance when it comes to Mecca, because at the time, no one in Europe knew what was going on there, which gave free rein to all fantasies. Dumas demystifies Mecca, and therefore indirectly Islam, which becomes familiar to the reader, including its prophet, because it includes his biography. Ducouré, for instance, recounts his love story with the beautiful Fatima he met in the great mosque of Mecca, just like many love affairs started at Sunday Mass in Europe, which brings the holy city closer to the reader. Muslims, strange beings from elsewhere, therefore become people like them. As a conclusion, Dumas shows an attraction and a deep empathy for Arabia in his four writings. The French amnesia with regard to his Arabian stories is paradoxical when it comes to a writer who has entered the Panthéon, Qabr al-Uzama. These writings are in the vein of French literary Orientalism, misunderstood as regard to this part of the Orient by the French, probably because they didn't dominate it, and unfortunately by the Arabs themselves. I have introduced and collected these stories in my last book, as you can see on the slide. And thanks to Dumas, we rediscover through it the memory of four very real characters. Two of them enjoyed ephemeral notoriety, Élise Eveillard and Louis Ducouré, and the two others having remained completely unknown, Arnaud and Vessières. Despite their great deeds accomplished with intrepidity and with little or no means, because they were not sent by anybody, it was just their own fate. These heroes have remained unknown. No place of memory recalls their name. They fell into oblivion like the writings that Dumas devoted to them, but also other France with a short memory. They have lived extraordinary adventures and have become paper heroes to rediscover, like four musketeers from Arabia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plan. If I may take the privilege to ask the first question. Dr. Ben, as I understood from you in our discussion before the lecture, that Alexander Dumas has never been in the Arabian Peninsula, yet he did all of these works. I wonder what were the main drivers of his interest in the Arabian Peninsula. And the other question I have in mind is, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm mistaken, that a lot of focus has been paid into the English and German Orientalist literature when it comes to Arabian Peninsula, but not more into the French and especially the work of Alexander Dumas. So if you can elaborate on that.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. Alexandre Dumas is part of this Orientalism, الاستشراق, which is very well known. على فكرة ممكن نتابع الحديث بالعربية. طيب ألكسندر دوما طبعا هو كاتب مؤلف من كل المؤلفين اللي في أوائل القرن التاسع عشر يهتموا بالشرق. هو اهتم خاصة في الشرق الأقرب اللي كان المغرب، وزار المغرب وقام برحلة إلى القوقاز، وكان عنده مخطط رحلة في كل حوض البحر الأبيض المتوسط والبحر الأحمر. في لعدة أسباب ترك الموضوع، وطالما تعرف على بعض الرحالة الفرنسيين اللي زاروا هالمناطق بدي ألف أولا رواية رحلة في سيناء، وثانيا هالرحلة اللي وصلت لكم إياها. هدفه كان التعريف للجمهور العام عن منطقة منسية أو غير معروفة، مع أنها استقبلت فرنسيين منذ الاحتلال المصري اللي بدي في هو دوما وزميله دوكوري ألفوا عمل بعد الانسحاب المصري ب10 سنين تقريبا، يعني 8 سنين. المصريين انسحبوا من الحجاز في عام 1840. بما أن المصريين ابتداء محمد علي باشا وبعدين ابنه إبراهيم جندوا فرنسيين، تعرفوا فرنسيين على المنطقة وألفوا كل أنواع المؤلفات، تقارير، روايات، حتى شعر عن الحجاز اللي اكتشفوها من خلال مشاركة في الغزو المصري. ولدرجة أن هذا شيء غير معروف، أنه آخر حاكم جدة قبل الانسحاب المصري بسنة كان حاكم مصري طبعا من سلالة محمد علي، بس كان فاشل نهائيا. فإذا جند وظف إيده اليمنى تقريبا الكولونيل ماري الفرنسي كحاكم جدة، يعني خلال سنة كاملة حكم مدينة جدة عقيد فرنسي اسمه الكولونيل ماري. فإذا دوما اهتم بالحجاز من خلال الاهتمام الفرنسي تجاه مصر والشرق بشكل عام. وبعد ما بعد هالفترة، أول شيء الاستشراق، وثاني شيء الاهتمام في الحجاز من خلال العيون المصرية إذا قلنا، تقريبا اختفى كل هالموضوع من الساحة العامة في فرنسا. والحقيقة مجرة جدة، فتنة جدة لعبت دور في هذا التطوير. السؤال الثاني الكتابات الفرنسية. أنا جمعت الكتابات الفرنسية عن مدينة جدة، وجمعتها إلى العام 1939 كل أنواع الكتابات المؤلفات. وعن مدينة جدة طبعا مش وصف بس مش وصف تاريخي الأحداث، بس ذكريات الفرنسيين اللي زاروا المدينة وكل الأدب، لأنه في مسرحيات، في روايات، في شعر عن مدينة جدة اللي ألفوها الفرنسيين، حتى في قطع موسيقية يعني سونات على البيانو بعنوان جدة. فإذا كلها من القرن التاسع عشر. جمعت 800 صفحة باللغة الفرنسية من مدينة جدة. هي طبعا بكثير أكبر عدد المراجع اللي الموجودة عن تاريخ جدة في القرن التاسع عشر حتى بداية القرن العشرين. حسب تقييمي 3/4 المصادر عن تاريخ جدة في هذا من أوائل القرن التاسع عشر لغاية الحرب العالمية الثانية هي مصادر فرنسية مع الأسف منسية.
ممكن نشوف لو في سؤال من الحضور، إذا في حد مهتم بسؤال أو حاجة. هنا في المايك.
تتكلم عربي or in English؟ أنا عربي.
بالعربي.
فرنسي.
فرنسي. bien sûr. merci beaucoup. شكرا جزيلا على هذا التقديم الرائع. نقاط بسيطة.
ممكن لو سمحت عرفنا اسمك
ثنتي مصعب الشمري. سؤالي، كثير من الرحالة اللي أتوا إلى الجزيرة في القرن التاسع عشر ثبت to say the least أن بعضهم كما وصفت يتخيل أمور، وبعضهم يكذب، يعني يدعي أنه وصل إلى مكة أو رأى أمور أو كذا. الديبكشن أوف الوهابي هورسمان الموجود، ما أعتقد أن في أحد يعرف الوهابيين أو أكثر منا. ما أعتقد أنه يماثل أي لبس، طريقة لبس الدولة السعودية الأولى أقرب إلى أيام العباسيين أو الأمويين. بالنسبة لليمن، تقول أنه أول واحد كان فيه البعثة الدنماركية اللي أعتقد سبقت هذه البعثة، بس إن ذكرت تحديدا مأرب، يمكن أول واحد وصل مأرب، إنما أعتقد في القرن الثامن عشر كانت البعثة الدنماركية. شكرا جزيلا.
أيوة طبعا البعثة الدنماركية هي أول واحدة 1744، ومن تعتبر أساس كل المعرفة الغربية عن جزيرة العرب. بس ما غطيت غير قسم بسيط جدة والمناطق المجاورة لأسباب مع الأسف معظم البعثة توفت مبكرا، ولحد الآن تعتبر نتائجها قيمة جدا. بس اللي اكتشفنا بعدين من خلال المؤلفات الفرنسية هي كل تفاصيل الحياة اليومية. هذا اللي تتميز فيها المؤلفات الفرنسية، الاهتمام بالحياة اليومية، حياة الأمم مش بس الكبار. وفي مدينة جدة اللي كانت المدينة الوحيدة المفتوحة للغربيين أيامها، بس حتى من خلال الرواية اللي ألقيت كلمتي عنها، المدن الأخرى زي مكة وبوعريش والطائف، حتى في أحيانا المدينة المنورة. الفرنسيين تقريبا يمكن 80 أو 90% من الكتابات الفرنسية عن الحجاز. بالعكس الإنجليز ألفوا كتير عن نجد والمناطق الأخرى. وفي أيضا عندك كتابات بوركهارت اللي هو سويسري، اللي كمان كاتب عظيم، وعلي باي العباسي اللي هو إسباني بس مجند في جيش نابليون. أنا في مركز فيصل قبل سنتين أصدرت مقال عن علاقات نابليون مع شريف مكة وبعدين مع الوهابيين. كان فيه اهتمام واسع بهذيك الفترة. وبالنسبة للمؤلفات اللي برأيي أعطيت اللي هالكتابات نوع من الأصالة، أنه معظم اللي ألفوها ما كان عندهم اهتمام غير الاهتمام الشخصي، ما كان عندهم برنامج يكون استعماري أو علمي أو مثلا. مع أنه البعثة الدنماركية كانت قيمة جدا، هي كان عندها مهمة. هو ملك دنمارك اللي أرسلها إلى جزيرة العرب، يعني كان عندهم طبعا هي كانت بعثة. بالعكس ديكوري هو كان هربان من فرنسا لحتى يندمج إلى جزيرة العرب. هذا يختلف طبعا.
شكرا. تفضل عزيزي.
دكتور حمد بسلامات التركي، نشكر لك الطرح والفوائد اللي قدمتها لنا. استفسار: هل كل رحالة يرتبط الاستكشاف عنده بالهدف السياسي؟ يعني غالب الرحالة يكون لهم أهداف سياسية، يعني بلدانهم ترسلهم تحقيق هدف سياسي وجمع معلومة معينة لتحقيق هدف سياسي. هل هذا صحيح؟
أيوة. لا، هذا غلط. مثل ما قلت، فرنسا ما كان عندها أي هدف استعماري في جزيرة العرب. ما كان عندهم غير كهدف منافسة الهيمنة الإنجليزية في البحر الأحمر، وليس في بعد السواحل. ما كان عندها أي اهتمام. على فكرة مش بس فرنسا، الناس ما بيستوعبوا أنه مع أنه الاستعمار كان المستعمرين كان عندهم خطط هيمنة على كل العالم. يمكن من المناطق النادرة اللي ما استهدفوها هي منطقة مكة. ما حدش حاول يغزو مكة، مع أنه هي بؤرة شيء غريب. فالفرنسيين، معظم الفرنسيين اللي اجوا مثل ما ذكرت عن طريق الباشا، عن طريق المصريين. فإذا لو كان عندهم هدف سياسي تقريبا، لأنهم الكثير منهم كانوا متجندين، ضباط، كان الهدف مصري وليس فرنسي مع أنهم كانوا فرنسيين. بس بعد توظيفهم في الجيش المصري تركوا الجيش، وبعدين عاشوا في مثلا أغنو الثاني، الرحل الثاني اللي حكينا عنه، فتح صيدلية في جدة واستقر في الصيدلية. كان عنده شريك إيطالي اللي سرق له كل أمواله وبعدين ترك جدة وزار اليمن. هي مغامرين كانوا أكثر شيء.
دكتور، متابعة لنفس السؤال، شد انتباهي ذكرت في المحاضرة أنه كان هناك اقتراح لتحالف عربي فرنسي، لكن فشل التحالف. ممكن توضيح الأسباب الفشل ولماذا ما تم؟
الفشل لأنه كل الأمور كانت خيالية. أول شيء الهدف كان منافسة الإنجليز، وفرنسا بما أنها اعتبرت حالة بلد النور والثورة، فكرت أنه بمصلحة العرب يتحالفوا معها. حتى لما فتحوا الفرنسيين الجزائر سموا هذا تحرير الجزائر. كان عندهم فكرة أنه بما أنه نحن أهدافنا نحن فرنسيين نبلاء، أكيد يتحالفوا معنا العرب ضد إنجلترا القذرة. فإذا قلنا أنه هذا طبعا أحلام أمور وهمية ما بتحصل في العالم، بس كان في نوع من البراءة، وكان في فعلا استعجبوا أدباء زي ألكسندر دوما وفيكتور هوغو ولامارتين يعني في هذا العصر الرومانتيكي بسيرة النبي، وفكروا أنه حتى نابليون كان نوعا ما يحاول يقلد سيرة النبي في مصر، لما طبعا في أهداف القصة معقدة، بس كان تأثروا كلهم من هذا السيرة، وفكروا أنه ممكن ينعاد التاريخ، ونحن مع العرب نعمل فتوحات جديدة ونتخلص العالم من العدو الإنجليزي الخبيث.
ممكن ناخذ آخر سؤال إذا في حد. تفضل دكتور. تفضل.
شكرا مرة أخرى. بالنسبة لاستعمار مكة، محاولة استعمار مكة، طبعا البرتغاليين حاولوا نزلوا في جدة
بس
في جدة، ولكن كان نيتهم إلى مكة، لولا أن قتلوا، وكان واضح وكان في اتفاق مع الصفويين باللقاء في مكة المكرمة.
لا البرتغاليين يهتموا في الموانئ. الوحيد اللي فعلا يهتم بمكة هو واحد من الصليبيين اسمه غونو دو شاتيون، اللي قتلوا صلاح الدين الأيوبي. هو حاول يغزو، عمل غزو، بس ما وصل أبعد من ينبوع البحر، بس كان هدف مكة بسبب ثروته وليس أهداف دينية بحت.
أيضا بالنسبة لألكسندر دوما، بما أنك كاتب كل هذه الكتب، هو كان طبعا عنده الأصول الأفريقية، العبودية من جهة الأم. هل كان لها تأثير في اهتمامه بالمنطقة؟ وأيضا كان يعتني كثير يعني من ضمن صفاته عملية الحشيش، وكانت تجي في كثير من مؤلفاته. هل ذكر في الحجاز، هل كان منتشر زي القهوة زي الحشيش في ذاك الوقت؟
الحق معك، كان عنده أصول إفريقية من طرف أمه اللي كانت من مواليد جزر الأنتي، بس من سلالات إفريقية. هو نفسه ما كتبش عن أصوله، بس أنا برأيي اهتمامه تجاه الشرق تأثر من هذا الأصل، لأنه هو كان حاسس من خلال مؤلفاته وكتاباته الواحد بيحس فعلا أنه ما عنده ولا عنصرية عن هالناس، عنده نوع من هو أنه متضامن مع كل شيء اسمه غير أوروبي. ثانيا بالنسبة شفت اللي بعدين نسيت آخر شيء. أيوة مزبوط. لا أنا اللي استغربت منه أنه هذا الأمام ما الحشيش لا مش غير موجود، ما وجدت أي شيء يتعلق بالحشيش ولا القات على فكرة في اليمن. لكن كل الأبطال، كل الناس اللي بيشوفوا على طول بيدخنوا أرجيلة طول الوقت، يكون على البوت أو جوا. أمير مكة بيدخن باستمرار، شيء فعلا كل أكيد ماتوا كل من سرطان صغار، تدخين مستمر.
شكرا دكتور بلال على المحاضرة الثرية، شكرا للحضور، ونتمنى نشوفكم مرة ثانية.